The global fight to end corruption. World leaders are meeting in London to tackle the scourge. Bribery and other crimes affect billions of people every day, and trillions of dollars are lost because of it. But can corruption ever be completely stamped out? This is Inside Story. Welcome to the program. I'm Fauziah Ibrahim. Corruption is a daily fact of life for many people. Sometimes it happens in broad daylight, or it's done behind closed doors by the rich and the powerful. But the effects of corruption are usually the same: depriving citizens of public wealth and basic services, and undermining public trust and the rule of law. Britain's Prime Minister David Cameron describes corruption as one of the greatest enemies of progress in our time, and he's gathered a mix of political leaders and civil society groups with the aim of producing a global declaration against corruption. Al Jazeera's Barnaby Phillips is at the meeting in London.
So some 40 governments gathered here at Lancaster House, but also big international institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, businesses, civil society. And we know what they've agreed. They've just come out with a summary. I'll give you a couple of highlights. 6 countries will establish public central registers of true company ownership. In other words, everyone will know who owns what companies in those 6 countries. 12 countries will establish mechanisms to prevent corrupt bidders from winning public contracts. Countries will work together to ensure the corrupt are brought to justice through a new international anti-corruption coordination centre to be based here in London. Well, it all sounds good, but of course the proof is in the pudding. Will these noble words and intentions translate into action? We won't know that for some time, but I think the hope of the participants here is that although they represent only a minority of countries across the world, it is a substantial minority, and it is an unusual collection of developed and developing countries, and together they hope to form a critical mass that could shame other countries into action.
Well, political leaders have a mammoth task ahead of them tackling corruption due to the sheer scale of its impact globally. The International Monetary Fund says corruption and bribery in particular siphon $2 trillion from the global economy every year. It also says the indirect costs of corruption may be even higher by slowing economic growth, increasing poverty and raising unemployment levels. When it comes to everyday life, Transparency International says around 1 in 4 people pay a bribe when interacting with key public institutions and services. And it's a problem that is thought to affect 6 billion people around the world. Let's now bring in our guests who join us from London. We have Kelso, the Advocacy Director at Transparency International. Hamzat Lawal is the co-founder of Follow the Money Nigeria, and Alex Cobham, Director of Research at the International Tax Justice Network. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for being with us. Mr. Kelso, if I can start with you. You're from Transparency International. Your organization defines corruption as the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. Explain to us, just how do you measure corruption?
Often it's very difficult, as we've seen in the Panama Papers, that people don't want to expose or be exposed how much money is being transferred, or of course if it's embezzlement or it's a crime, drug money as well, organized crime, they don't want to have it seen. We use corruption perception index as one of the things that we've used, but also different like household surveys as well to find out what is the amount of bribes that people are paying. So an East Africa bribery index works in Uganda and Kenya and Tanzania to ask people at the household level, have you paid a bribe, and to who, which police officer or which health official, to get seen by a doctor.
Mr. Alex Cobham, it's very difficult to measure the levels of corruption. I mean, it's not a tangible thing that you can count, really. Is Transparency International's method the best way?
I think it's worth thinking, if we'd had an anti-corruption summit 10 years ago, we would have been talking really about a problem only in developing countries we'd have had discussions about African kleptocrats. And I think the Corruption Perceptions Index perhaps points back to that moment in time. You know, most of the index is simply an association with levels of poverty, actually. So although I think it was useful, and obviously, you know, we work with Transparency International and their chapters do an enormous amount of good work on this, I think that particular measure doesn't really help us. We look at things much more from the side of the financial secrecy that drives corruption. You know, what we've seen in the Panama Papers is that countries all over the world are suffering corruption simply through the leaks that come from one law firm in Panama. So we prefer an index of financial secrecy, which shows which centres are really providing the kind of anonymous company formation, the lack of exchange of information between countries, the opacity of company accounts, all of which contribute to corruption in different forms, including tax avoidance by multinationals all around the world. And when you look through that end of the telescope, what you see is that the UK and its network of overseas territories and crown dependencies is actually the biggest single actor in global financial secrecy. That's why it makes so much sense that the summit is here today, but it's also why it's disappointing to see how little has really been achieved in terms of demanding that those territories and dependencies deliver more transparency.
I do want to come back to the issue of financial secrecy and the Panama Papers as well, but I want to also get a crux of the definition of corruption. Just what is corruption? And I want to throw this question to Mr. Hamzat. Lawal, Nigeria was famously described by Prime Minister Cameron as being fantastically corrupt. Now, just what is corruption to the average Nigerian? What does it mean to them?
Well, what it means to them is not being able to send their children to school. What it means to them is the over 10 million children that are out of school presently in Nigeria. And what it also means is not able to provide healthcare services or even access healthcare services. That is what it means to us in Nigeria as corruption, because due to this illicit flow of funds that leaves our economy, and it's mostly in the UK and in other European Union and the US economy, this has now hampered development practices in Nigeria. And when I say in Nigeria, I mean on the grassroots level. These are people who probably cannot even afford 3 square meals due to the impact of corrupt practices in the country.
All right, well, let's stay with the grassroots level, Mr. Lawal. And I want to ask you then, is corruption so prevalent on the grassroots level, in the political system, in Nigeria, that it's become an accepted way of life? It is accepted, it is anticipated, and people work with it.
No, not at all. Because again, the people in Nigeria are not that empowered to be able to even ask for what their rights are. Most of the people at the grassroots level don't even understand governance is. And they don't speak this kind of language that we're speaking here right now. Most of them are not empowered. But what we've been able to do as Follow the Money is to ensure that we embrace technology tools. In every household in Nigeria, there's a mobile phone, irrespective of it not connected to the internet. But so what we've been able to do to ensure that we're able to track funds from the national to the subnational and the local level is to see how we get report from these people who are on the ground, people who want the basic amenities, want to ensure that they're able to provide food for their people, want to ensure that they're able to send their children to school or take their children to the hospital and get good healthcare services, all better service delivery, and ensure that promises made by the politicians are kept.
I want to stay with the issue of the grassroots level and what's happening on the ground. Mr. Kelso, is it fair to say that some corrupt practices have become cultural norms, that people have come to accept that, okay, if I have to do business or if I have to go about my daily life, yes, I have to pay a bribe to ensure that things get done?
I think you could try to guess that that might happen, but quite frankly, I don't think anyone anywhere wants to feel unfairly pressured. In particular, what we found with our chapters, we have over 100 chapters worldwide, we found that a lot of people can't pay these bribes, and sometimes it becomes a matter of life and death. So we operate advice centers, hotlines, where people can call in. One of the things that we found was in Morocco, where 50% of the people say, more than 50% say that they've had to pay little bribes to be able to access health care, to see a doctor or get, one case was a brain scan, that by being able to call a hotline and call in the officials, that they were actually able to push back a bit and have the person arrested at the hospital that was asking for an extra 600 dirham of bribe to be able to have the kind of test that you needed. So I think that a lot of people are waiting and hoping that they can do that sort of reporting and push back against officials who want bribes, but they need to have some sort of protection to make sure they don't face reprisals.
Well, exactly. That's the issue. Transparency International is calling for protection for these whistleblowers as well. Do you think that will come through? I mean, what sort of protection are you suggesting?
Well, we were looking at international standards to make sure that the bar was raised so that in adopting across Europe, for example, we did a study that said everyone had to try to raise the bar and try to increase the amount of protection, witness protection, as well as making sure that those who are unfairly penalized for blowing the whistle actually do have some sort of recourse to justice or are protected from losing their jobs or losing their reputation. So the Luxembourg leaks person, for example, was just recently the charges were dropped, but that was after a campaign that was led by Transparency International to make sure there was not going to be a penalization for this man who finally revealed to the world how much was being evaded in taxes in Luxembourg.
Mr. Cobham, there are several layers of corruption. You have the, as we were talking about, the on the ground, the everyday occurrence, for example, bribing the police, the traffic police in order to get out of speeding fine. And then, of course, you have the higher level ones. We were talking about financial secrecy. We're talking about tax avoidance as well. Does one exist because of the other, or are they two separate issues altogether? Or do they have to be tackled separately?
I think they're very much tied up together. You know, we heard Hamzat talk about the disempowerment of people at the local level, but also Casey talk about the importance of protecting the power of whistleblowers to bring more information to light. In both cases, we're really talking about the ability and the power of people to challenge inequalities that exist. Corruption is a form of inequality. It's an unequal power relationship that worsens the actual inequality and poverty people live under. So in that sense, this is very much tied together. I think the other link is really, we're talking about effective states. When we think about the LuxLeaks case, for example, you know, we're talking about massive revenue losses due to what was largely actually multinational tax avoidance rather than evasion, but still with the effect that states didn't have the revenues to be effective. Now take that down to the lower level, and you don't have basic public services for people, but also you don't have a state which is expected to be responsive and accountable because it simply doesn't have the capacity. The Nigerian state raises something like 4% of its GDP in taxes. So even although it has additional resources from oil, it simply doesn't have the capacity to have an effective state. And of course, that works out for people who are poor in a much worse way than it does for people who are rich. In other words, it exacerbates the inequality they're already facing. So all these aspects of corruption really are tied up together. And as we've heard, I think a consensus among the three of us here, what's really needed is finding different ways to get different bits of information about which payments are being made and where the money is going to different people in order to empower them to hold the relevant actors, whether they're multinationals or the state or others, to account in order to reduce the effect of corruption in driving inequality.
Mr. Lawal, would you say that there is one method in order to tackle corruption on the ground as well as on the higher levels, or it's two separate issues?
Well, it's the same thing. What is key is collaboration. We need to see collaborative effort. We need to see more openness in the terms of people who are doing businesses, the government agencies, and most importantly, the international bodies. Yes, as much as we want to see difference, we need to see openness in terms of data. How is data able to become more open, more easily accessible, so that civil society activists can use this information to empower citizens? For instance, in Nigeria, presently, there are over 300 children who need healthcare services. All they need is for their government to release funds for remediation. But up to this moment, these children have higher lead level, over 200 lead level in their blood. And then government is not responsive to that effect. And then how do you expect citizens to take that? Because as much as we want to deal with this, we need that collaboration. We don't just need political will or we need statements. We need to see actions on the ground. We need to see national level actions. We need to see sub-national level and local level. This would connect to regional level because Nigeria has a key role to play. We inspire other African countries, and we have to take the lead on this in the continent so that this can connect to what we're doing across board in the international level.
Mr. Kelso, in terms of tackling the corruption issue, do you start from the higher level, from government levels, or do you start from the ground?
I think a good strategist would say it's both. You come from the top and the bottom. So I'd congratulate Hamzat for President Buhari's showing today. The commitments that Nigeria made was to open data, to open contracting, to the open data, for example, being that citizens get to know what is the budget for their local school or their local hospital, to know how much should have been there, or local procurement. So where is that bridge that is in the budget but has not materialized, as well as the open listing of companies that are being formed in Nigeria so that people know who are the true owners behind that. So President Buhari has come off very, very well in terms of leadership of both the African continent as well as any of the countries that were there, including England.
I want to come back to the issue of financial secrecy, and I want to throw this question to you, Mr. Lawal. Ahead of the London summit, several civil groups in Nigeria have said that efforts to fight corruption in the country is undermined by the failure to tackle money laundering in the UK. Explain this to us. How does what happens in Nigeria is actually controlled in the UK?
Well, because what happened in the UK is UK has provided safe haven for all these funds that are coming in, not just UK, even the US and other European Union countries. And what happens is funds, taxpayers' money or revenue generated from our natural resources are brought here. And what this means is to expand inequalities in the society. And what this means is not being able to ensure that people on the ground get better service delivery for what they own or what they benefit from.
Mr. Cobham, is it fair that multinational corporations and foreign governments be held accountable for what is perceived to be or linked to perceived corrupt practices in other countries?
Well, look, I mean, one thing we see in the Panama Papers is that a great many countries suffer due to the behaviour of what are largely international players, international banks, some of them high street names, international law firms acting as intermediaries. The involvement of the states themselves, their ability to defend themselves, is relatively limited. It's a global phenomenon driven by financial secrecy. So I think that the days when we might say, look at that country over there, they've got a corruption problem, I think those days really are behind us.
But let me just stop you there and come back to the Panama Papers, though. A lot of what happened with the Panama Papers it's not actually illegal. You could say that it was the financial institutions, the bankers, the lawyers, the advisors, they're all perhaps acted immorally, but not illegally.
Well, actually, I think we do see a great deal of illegality, and I think we'll see more prosecutions as this goes along. What we've certainly seen are cases of clear political conflicts of interest. We've seen ministers resign in Iceland and Spain over things that appear to be indefensible. We've seen one of the biggest, perhaps the most brutal international cross-border financial criminal gang from Mexico heavily involved in using these structures. And we've seen an increasing number of individuals apparently evading taxes and multinationals potentially involved in tax avoidance. Indeed, one case we saw was an attempted capital gains tax avoidance that, if successful, would have cost Uganda in 1 year more than its entire health budget. So this isn't just a question of morality. There is a very clear issue here that secrecy is being used in different ways, sometimes legal, very often not, in order to strip away resources that would otherwise be there for development. And of course that exacerbates global inequality as well as inequality within countries. And it makes progressive taxation, raising sufficient revenues to run an effective state, very difficult indeed.
Mr. Kelso, in his opening speech at the summit, Prime Minister Cameron proposed stricter measures to ensure professionals like lawyers, accountants, the financial advisors that we're talking about, don't become enablers, as he mentioned, enablers to corruption. But can they be held accountable for doing their jobs, for being hired to do their jobs?
Well, that's part of it, to answer the question before as well, is that there's a lot of things that were legal previously. It used to be tax deductible to give bribes for business deals. It no longer is at this point. That was 10 years ago. Now at this point, then a lot of the stuff that has to happen is that the implementation of the commitments that were made today in London have to take place into a law, so it's a prosecutable offense. So in particular, I think that the enablers question is quite a good one. given that there's not that much, there are standards out there, but they're voluntary standards. There needs to be a toughening up of how do you deal with a lawyer or an accountant or someone who is a financial services advisor who actually facilitates corruption. Then they should be behind bars, or they should suffer some sort of disbarment, or in other way punished for their participation in illicit financial flows.
Mr. Kelso, we continually hear of the most and least corrupt countries in the world. Credit is never really given to those who rise up the ranks, who have been able to tackle corruption. Give us one example of one country who's been able to do that. And can their model be replicated elsewhere?
Well, we try not to use these rankings from the Corruption Perception Index as the gold standard, as Alex has alluded to, that it's more of a measure to start a conversation with a country. But to give one example in particular, Nigeria or South Africa. South Africa became a founding member of the Open Government Partnership. They have made promising commitments under that Open Government Partnership last Friday, that they were also going to have an access to information law, that they would have a beneficial ownership register, a listing of all those owners of companies. So South Africa is trying to move forward in some ways, despite lots of setbacks in news. Nigeria has done the same thing with the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, trying to make sure they open their books to how much taxes, how much after-tax profits are being made by companies. And now that the new step, now that they have a register, now that they're going to open up who are the company owners in Nigeria or foreign companies that are going to be domiciled in Nigeria, it seems to be opening up. It seems like it's moving forward a bit in terms of the transparency and pushing back against the secrecy that's enabled scandals like the Panama Papers.
Mr. Cobham, do you think Nigeria's model of success, or seeming success, can be replicated elsewhere in the world?
Well, I think we know that there are measures governments need to put in place in terms of domestic transparency that are important, and yeah, and Casey's talked about a lot there. That there's a real agenda there for many governments, both rich and poor. I think the other aspect, though, is about the transparency that they offer to other countries, or rather the secrecy that they offer. We've seen some jurisdictions, including among the UK's crown dependencies, take significant steps towards greater transparency. But a lot of the financial centres, both big and small, continue to resist that kind of transparency, and that makes them continue to be drivers of corruption. So I think there really is a question, and the biggest holdout of all, of course, is the United States of America, which continues to offer anonymous company formation. In fact, their states compete with each other to do it more cheaply, and at the same time refuses to provide information to other countries, despite demanding tax information automatically from them. So I think we're seeing global progress, and that's really going to drive this along. But those big holdouts, and particularly the United States and the United Kingdom's secrecy network, that's really the big obstacle. That's where I think we'll see the most progress against corruption, if we can keep the pressure for greater transparency on.
Mr. Lawal, do you see a time when your country, Nigeria, will be able to stamp out corruption totally?
Yes, I see that time. And yesterday was historic. The fact that my president said that he wants our looted fund back to the country, that is really historic. And for us, we want to ensure that as long as this money comes back, we need to do ground truthing, where we would ensure that every single kobo, as soon as it arrives, it does not go to corrupt politicians or government officials' pockets, but it's trickle down to the ground where we can see better service delivery to the citizens of the people. So yes, it begins now. This event, this summit is historic, and we can get it right as long as we get collaboration and partnership across board, where we see more openness, more transparency and accountability in the business, in the government, and most importantly, at the citizen in-country level.
On that note, gentlemen, we're going to have to leave the discussion. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you to all our guests, Casey, Kelso, Hamzat, Lawal, and Alex Cobham. And thank you, too, for watching. You can always watch the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Fauziah Ibrahim, and the whole team, we're very grateful for your viewership. Thank you for watching.